The white silk ribbon fell from my trembling fingers as my sister's voice cut through the chapel air like a blade. "Nicole, you and the other adopted kids need to sit in the back rows. Family photos are for real family only." My breath caught in my throat. Around me, 200 wedding guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their whispered conversations dying to awkward silence. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished wooden pews, but all I could see was Victoria's cold stare as she adjusted her pearl necklace with the same dismissive gesture she'd used since we were children. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." I'd spent 3 weeks handcrafting the floral arrangements that now decorated every surface of this Portland chapel. 3 weeks of 12-hour days after my regular shifts at Chen Industries, bleeding my savings dry to give my sister the perfect wedding she'd dreamed about since we were kids, sharing bunk beds in our cramped Beaverton home. But as I stood there in my carefully chosen lavender dress, the one Victoria had specifically requested for her maid of honor, I realized that 23 years of sisterhood meant nothing when bloodlines were drawn in the sand. The morning had started with such promise. I'd arrived at the Riverside Country Club at dawn, my Honda Civic loaded with the last of the centerpieces I'd been perfecting for weeks. The venue was everything Victoria had wanted, perched on a bluff overlooking the Willamette River with its sweeping views of the Cascade Mountains. Portland's skyline sparkled in the distance, and the October air carried the crisp scent of changing leaves mixed with the lingering fragrance of late-blooming roses from the club's meticulously maintained gardens. Grace Martinez, the wedding planner, had greeted me with genuine warmth as I carried in box after box of white orchids and baby's breath arrangements. "Nicole, these are absolutely stunning," she'd said, running her fingers gently over the delicate petals. "You have such an incredible eye for design. Victoria is lucky to have such a talented sister." Sister. The word had filled me with pride then, just as it had every time someone used it throughout our lives. I was 18 months older than Victoria, adopted by Pat and Robert Harper when I was 3 years old, just 6 months before Victoria was born. In my earliest memories, we were inseparable. Pat used to joke that we were twins who just happened to arrive through different doorways, and for most of our childhood, that's exactly how it felt. We'd shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams about our future weddings where we'd be each other's maid of honor. Victoria would describe her perfect day in elaborate detail: the flowers, the dress, the first dance, and always, her big sister Nicole standing beside her at the altar. Those conversations felt like sacred promises, whispered commitments that bound us together tighter than any biological connection ever could. But something had shifted in Victoria over the past few years. It started small, comments that felt like paper cuts. "Well, you don't really understand family traditions, Nicole, since you didn't grow up with them from birth." Or, "Mom always says I look exactly like Grandma Harper, such a strong family resemblance. It must be nice not to worry about that kind of pressure." The remarks became more frequent after our father died 2 years ago, as if his death had somehow weakened the glue that held our assembled family together. Still, when Victoria asked me to be her maid of honor 8 months ago, I'd cried with joy. We were sitting in our favorite coffee shop downtown, the Daily Grind, where we'd been meeting for sister dates since Victoria started college. She'd slid the small wrapped box across the wooden table with that familiar smile, the one that had gotten us both out of trouble countless times as kids. "Open it," she'd urged, bouncing in her seat with excitement. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with "Sisters by Heart" on one side and "Maid of Honor" on the other. "Nicole, I can't imagine my wedding day without you right there beside me. Will you do it?" I'd hugged her so tightly that other customers in the cafe turned to look, tears streaming down both our faces. "Of course," I'd whispered. I'd been practicing my maid of honor speech since we were kids. The months that followed were a whirlwind of dress fittings, venue visits, and late-night phone calls about seating arrangements and menu selections. Victoria included me in every decision, or so it seemed. We'd spend entire weekends spread across her apartment floor with wedding magazines, sticky notes, and color swatches, planning what she called the most perfect day in the history of perfect days. I threw myself into the role with the dedication I brought to everything in my life. My job as a project coordinator at Chen Industries kept me busy during the week, managing construction timelines and client communications for one of Portland's most prestigious development companies, but my evenings and weekends belonged entirely to Victoria's wedding. I researched photographers, taste-tested dozens of cake flavors, and spent hours on Pinterest creating inspiration boards for everything from centerpieces to bridesmaid hairstyles. The floral arrangements became my special project. Victoria had fallen in love with an elaborate orchid and rose design she'd seen in a bridal magazine, but the florist's quote came back at nearly $8,000, well beyond her budget even with the generous contribution our mother was making. "I guess I'll have to choose something simpler," Victoria had said, trying to hide her disappointment as she set the magazine aside. "What if I made them?" I'd suggested without thinking. I took those floral design classes at community college before I started working full-time. I bet I could create something even more beautiful for a fraction of the cost. Victoria's face had lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You'd do that for me?" "Of course," I'd said, already mentally calculating the cost of wholesale flowers and supplies. Sisters help sisters make their dreams come true, right? What followed were weeks of intensive research and practice. I watched YouTube tutorials until my eyes burned, practiced different arrangement techniques until my fingers were permanently stained with plant sap, and slowly transformed my small apartment into a floral laboratory. The dining table disappeared under buckets of water and cutting tools. My kitchen counter became a staging area for ribbon and wire. My living room turned into a drying station where completed arrangements waited for the wedding day. The financial investment was significant. My savings account, carefully built over 2 years of overtime shifts and skipped vacation days, dwindled with each wholesale flower order. But every time Victoria sent me a text about how excited she was about the flowers, or when she bragged to her friends about her incredibly talented sister, it felt worth every penny and every hour of lost sleep. Michael Chen had been surprisingly supportive throughout the planning process. I'd met Victoria's fiancé several times over the past year, and he'd always been polite, if somewhat reserved. He was clearly successful. His family owned Chen Industries, the same company where I worked, though in different divisions that rarely interacted. He drove a pristine BMW, wore expensive suits, and had the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to worry about money. Victoria had met him at a charity fundraiser downtown, one of those Portland social events where the city's young professionals gathered to network over wine and good causes. She'd been working as a marketing assistant for a local nonprofit then, trying to build connections that might lead to better opportunities. Michael had approached her during the silent auction, impressed by her knowledge of the art pieces being sold. Their first date was dinner at Le Pigeon, one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants, followed by a private wine tasting that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Their relationship moved quickly. Within 6 months, Victoria had moved into Michael's downtown condo with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of the river. Within a year, she'd quit her nonprofit job to focus on planning their future together, supported by Michael's generous allowance. The engagement came at Christmas, with a proposal on a Hawaiian beach that Victoria documented extensively on social media, each photo more romantic than the last. I was genuinely happy for her. Michael treated her well, their lifestyle was comfortable, and Victoria seemed to be living the fairy tale she'd always dreamed about. If I sometimes felt a twinge of sadness about how much our relationship had changed since Michael entered the picture, I pushed those feelings aside. Sisters support each other's happiness, even when that happiness sometimes feels distant from your own life. The only concerning moment had come 3 months before the wedding, during what was supposed to be a fun bridesmaid shopping trip. Victoria, her 3 college friends, and I had spent the day at Washington Square Mall, looking for accessories and shoes to complete their wedding day looks. Everything had been going perfectly until we stopped for lunch at the food court. "I'm so nervous about meeting Michael's extended family," one of the bridesmaids, Ashley, had said while picking at her salad. "His dad seems so intimidating. All that business success and community involvement. I heard he's on like 5 different charity boards." "Thomas Chen is actually really sweet once you get to know him," Victoria had replied. "He's just very traditional about family values and maintaining the family reputation. Michael says his dad takes the Chen family legacy very seriously." "What do you mean by traditional?" another bridesmaid, Rachel, had asked. Victoria had glanced around the crowded food court before leaning in closer to the table. Well, he has some old-fashioned ideas about marriage and family structure. He thinks children should be raised by their biological parents whenever possible, that adoption disrupts natural family bonds. Michael says it's just generational thinking, but it makes his dad uncomfortable when families are too blended. The comment had hit me like cold water. Victoria, you know I'm adopted, right? I'd said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. Of course I know that, she'd snapped back, looking irritated at having to explain herself. But you're different. You've been part of our family since you were tiny. It's not like you're some random stranger we took in. The distinction felt like a slap, but I'd swallowed my hurt and changed the subject. Victoria seemed oblivious to how her words had affected me, chatting cheerfully about wedding favors and reception music for the rest of the meal. I'd spent the drive home wondering if I should say something more, but by the time I pulled into Victoria's driveway, she was already moving on to concerns about her dress fitting the following week. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That conversation lurked in the back of my mind over the following months, but Victoria's continued enthusiasm for having me as her maid of honor seemed to prove that whatever her future father-in-law's opinions might be, they didn't affect her feelings about our relationship. She included me in the final venue walkthrough, asked for my opinion on last-minute music changes, and even insisted that I give a speech at the rehearsal dinner. The rehearsal dinner the night before had been held at an upscale restaurant in the Pearl District, Portland's trendy arts district where exposed brick walls and modern art created an atmosphere of sophisticated urban elegance. The Chen family had spared no expense, flying in relatives from California and hiring a photographer to document every moment of the evening. I'd worn my best dress, a navy blue sheath that I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and spent extra time on my hair and makeup. The evening started wonderfully. Victoria looked radiant in a flowing white cocktail dress, and Michael seemed relaxed and happy as he introduced me to various family members and friends. This is Nicole, Victoria's sister and maid of honor, he'd say warmly. She's the one who created all those incredible floral arrangements you'll see tomorrow. Thomas Chen, Michael's father, had been polite but distant when we were introduced. He was an imposing man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of authoritative presence that filled whatever room he entered. His handshake was firm, his smile perfectly practiced, but his eyes seemed to look through me rather than at me. Nice to meet you, he'd said before quickly turning his attention to someone else. I'd given my maid of honor speech midway through the dinner, sharing stories about growing up with Victoria and expressing how honored I felt to stand beside her on her wedding day. The room had responded warmly, with several people commenting afterward about how touching and heartfelt my words had been. Victoria had hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes, whispering, "Thank you for being the best sister anyone could ask for." But as the evening progressed, I'd begun to notice subtle undercurrents that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Thomas Chen seemed to be holding quiet conversations with various family members, his expression serious and his voice too low for me to hear the actual words. Michael's uncle had asked me pointed questions about my background, and seemed surprised when I mentioned working at Chen Industries. "Oh, you work for the family company," he'd said with raised eyebrows. I wasn't aware of that connection. Victoria had brushed off my concerns when I mentioned them during a brief moment alone in the restaurant's restroom. "You're being paranoid," she'd said while touching up her lipstick. "Everyone loves you. Michael's family just takes time to warm up to new people. Tomorrow is going to be perfect, I promise." I'd chosen to believe her, pushing aside the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. This was Victoria's weekend, her moment to shine, and I was determined not to let my own insecurities overshadow her happiness. The wedding morning had begun at 5 a.m. in the bridal suite at the Riverside Country Club. Victoria, her 3 bridesmaids, our mother, and I had transformed the elegant room into a bustling preparation center filled with makeup cases, curling irons, and the gentle chaos of women getting ready for a momentous occasion. Coffee and pastries from a local bakery provided fuel for the hours of primping ahead. Victoria had been in an excellent mood, dancing around the room in her silk robe while her favorite playlist filled the air with upbeat pop songs. She'd insisted on taking dozens of photos, getting ready shots, sisterly bonding moments, candid laughs over shared memories. For those precious morning hours, it felt exactly like the childhood dream we'd shared about her wedding day. "I can't believe this is actually happening," she'd said while I carefully pinned her veil in place, the delicate lace cascading down her back like a waterfall of dreams. "Thank you for making everything so beautiful, Nicole. I don't know how I would have done any of this without you." The photographer had captured that moment, my hands gentle in Victoria's hair, both of us smiling at her reflection in the ornate mirror. It was the kind of image that should have graced a wedding album for decades to come, a testament to the unbreakable bond between sisters who'd chosen each other across the arbitrary boundaries of biology and law. By 10 a.m., Victoria was fully transformed. Her dress, a stunning mermaid-style gown with intricate beadwork, fit her perfectly. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased the diamond earrings Michael had given her as a wedding gift. She looked like every bride's dream of herself come to life, radiant and confident and utterly beautiful. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 11:30, with photos beforehand in the chapel and gardens. I'd already checked that my floral arrangements were perfectly positioned, the white orchids and roses creating elegant focal points throughout the sanctuary. Everything was exactly as Victoria had envisioned, down to the smallest details. That's when Grace Martinez had approached me with a concerned expression, her usual professional composure slightly shaken. "Nicole, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" she'd asked, gesturing toward a quiet corner of the bridal suite. My stomach immediately clenched with worry. Is something wrong with the flowers? Did one of the arrangements fall over? "No, the flowers are absolutely perfect," Grace had said quickly. "It's about the ceremony seating. Victoria asked me to speak with you about a change in the processional order." "A change?" I'd repeated, confusion clouding my thoughts. We'd practiced the processional multiple times during the rehearsal. I was supposed to walk down the aisle last, just before Victoria's entrance, as the maid of honor traditionally did. Grace had looked distinctly uncomfortable as she delivered the message. "Victoria wants you to be seated before the processional begins. She said there's been a family decision about the ceremony structure." The words had made no sense. "I don't understand. I'm the maid of honor. I'm supposed to stand with Victoria during the ceremony." "I know this is confusing," Grace had said gently. "Maybe you should talk to Victoria directly about the details. I was just asked to let you know about the timing change." Walking back toward Victoria felt like moving through thick water, each step harder than the last. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all of them laughing about something on someone's phone, the air filled with the light energy that should have characterized the happiest day of her life. "Victoria," I'd said, my voice carefully controlled. "Grace mentioned something about a change in the ceremony? Something about seating?" Victoria had looked up from the phone screen, her expression shifting from carefree joy to something harder to read. "Oh, that. Yes, there's been a slight modification to the family arrangement." "What kind of modification?" She'd glanced around at her bridesmaids, who had suddenly found other things to focus their attention on. "Nicole, could we talk privately for just a minute?" We'd stepped into the attached bathroom, the space that had been filled with laughter and sisterly bonding just hours earlier now feeling cramped and tense. Victoria had closed the door behind us and turned to face me, her wedding dress rustling against the marble tiles. "Nicole, I need you to understand that this isn't personal," she'd begun, her hands fidgeting with her bouquet. "Michael's family has some traditional expectations about wedding ceremonies, and we've decided it's best to honor those traditions today." "I still don't understand what that means for me," I'd said, though a cold dread was beginning to settle in my chest. Victoria had taken a deep breath, the same way she used to before delivering news she knew would upset our parents. "The Chen family believes that wedding ceremonies should reflect the true family structure, the biological connections that tie people together through generations. They think it's important for the photos and the ceremony itself to show the authentic family relationships." The words had hit me like a physical blow, but I'd forced myself to remain calm. "Victoria, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "You're still my maid of honor," she'd said quickly, as if that title could somehow soften what was coming next. But you'll be seated with the extended family during the ceremony instead of standing with the wedding party. And for the family photos, we're going to focus on the biological relatives. The extended family, I'd repeated slowly, the full impact of her words beginning to sink in. You mean with the cousins and family friends? It's just for today, Victoria had insisted. It doesn't change anything between us. You're still my sister. This is just about honoring Michael's family traditions. I'd stared at her in the bathroom mirror, seeing my own face pale beneath the carefully applied makeup I'd spent an hour perfecting. Victoria, I've been your sister for 23 years. I've spent months planning this wedding, thousands of dollars on flowers, and weeks arranging my work schedule to be here for everything you needed. And now you're telling me that I don't count as real family? You're being dramatic, she'd snapped, her own stress and tension finally showing through the bridal facade. This isn't about you, Nicole. This is my wedding day, and I need everything to go smoothly. Michael's dad is very important in the business community, and this wedding is being photographed for several social publications. We can't afford for anything to look complicated. Complicated, I'd whispered, the word feeling like poison in my mouth. You know what I mean, Victoria had said, avoiding my eyes in the mirror. Some people don't understand blended families the way we do. It's easier to keep things simple today. I'd wanted to scream, to demand that she remember every shared memory, every promise we'd made to each other, every time she'd called me her best friend and closest confidant. Instead, I'd simply nodded and walked out of the bathroom, leaving her standing alone among the scattered makeup brushes and empty coffee cups. The next hour had passed in a surreal haze. I'd mechanically helped Victoria with final preparations, pinned her train in place, and handed her the bouquet I'd crafted with my own hands. The other bridesmaids had clearly sensed the tension but seemed unsure how to address it, offering me sympathetic glances while maintaining the cheerful energy Victoria expected from her wedding party. When it came time for photos, the painful reality of Victoria's decision became even more clear. The photographer positioned the bridesmaids, all of Victoria's college sorority sisters, in a beautiful arrangement around the bride. I stood off to the side, no longer part of the intimate circle that would be preserved forever in wedding albums and anniversary celebrations. Where would you like Nicole? The photographer had asked, clearly confused by the family dynamics he was witnessing. Oh, she'll be seated during the ceremony, Victoria had said breezily. She can join the extended family photos later. The photographer had looked between Victoria and me with obvious uncertainty, but his job was to capture the day as the bride envisioned it, not to question family decisions that seemed to contradict everything he'd been told during the planning sessions. That's how I'd found myself walking alone down the chapel aisle 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, carrying the lavender dress that matched the bridesmaids' gowns but would now mark me as something different, something less. The sanctuary was already filling with guests, Michael's extended family and business associates taking their places in the premium seating near the front. I'd been directed to the fourth row back, behind Michael's cousins and college friends, in a section that felt like exile from the family I'd thought was mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was surrounded by the very floral arrangements I'd created, the white orchids and roses that had cost me my savings but would forever be associated with the day my sister decided I wasn't worth including in her real family photos. That's when Victoria had made the announcement that would change everything, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel's excellent acoustics as she addressed not just me, but several other family members whose connections were apparently deemed insufficient for the front row treatment. Nicole, you and the other adopted kids need to sit in the back rows. Family photos are for real family only. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment that felt like eternity, 200 wedding guests sat in complete silence, waiting to see how this painful family drama would unfold in real time. The chapel fell into a suffocating silence that seemed to stretch for hours, though it could have only been seconds. I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes turning toward me, some filled with pity, others with the uncomfortable fascination people have for witnessing someone else's public humiliation. My hands trembled as I gripped the back of the wooden pew, the polished surface suddenly feeling like the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted beneath my feet. Standing there in my carefully chosen lavender dress, surrounded by the white orchid arrangements I'd spent my life savings creating, I realized that every assumption I'd made about my place in this family had been built on quicksand. Victoria's words echoed in my mind like a judge's verdict, final and irrevocable. Nicole, you and the other adopted kids need to sit in the back rows. Family photos are for real family only. Other adopted kids. The phrase cut deeper than even the initial rejection because it revealed how Victoria truly saw me, not as her sister who happened to be adopted, but as one of a category of lesser relatives to be managed and contained. I glanced around and spotted Michael's teenage cousin Danny, whom I'd met the night before at the rehearsal dinner. His face was flushed with embarrassment as he awkwardly gathered his suit jacket and moved toward the back of the chapel. Apparently, he too had been deemed insufficiently authentic for the front row family section. The moment stretched until Grace Martinez, the wedding planner, appeared at my elbow with the kind of professional discretion that probably saved dozens of weddings from complete disaster. "Nicole," she whispered gently, "why don't we find you a lovely seat where you can still see everything perfectly?" Her kindness was almost harder to bear than Victoria's cruelty. I nodded wordlessly and allowed Grace to guide me toward the back of the chapel, past rows of Michael's business associates and distant relatives who averted their eyes as I walked by. The click of my heels against the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud in the continued silence, each step a public declaration of my newly diminished status. I slid into a pew in the 7th row, surrounded by people I didn't recognize, my hands folded tightly in my lap to stop their shaking. From this distance, the altar where I was supposed to have stood beside Victoria looked impossibly far away, like viewing someone else's life through the wrong end of a telescope. The white orchids I'd arranged with such care mocked me from their positions of honor, beautiful reminders of my foolish belief that love and effort could earn you a permanent place in someone's heart. The ceremony proceeded as planned, though the earlier tension had cast a shadow over what should have been pure celebration. Victoria glided down the aisle on our stepfather's arm, radiant in her beaded gown, her smile picture-perfect as she approached Michael at the altar. If she felt any guilt about what had just transpired, it didn't show on her face. She looked like a woman who had successfully arranged her wedding day exactly as she'd envisioned it, with all the messy complications of real family dynamics neatly swept aside. Michael's expression was harder to read. He stood tall and confident in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, but there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the scene that had just unfolded. When his gaze swept the congregation during the opening remarks, it lingered briefly on me in the back row before returning to his bride. I wondered what he was thinking, whether this public rejection of his soon-to-be sister-in-law aligned with his own values or if he was simply acquiescing to family pressure he felt powerless to resist. The minister began the familiar words about love and commitment, about the sacred bonds that tie families together through joy and sorrow. The irony was so sharp it was almost physically painful. Here was Victoria, promising to honor and cherish her new husband, while having just demonstrated that honor and cherishing were conditional gifts she could withdraw whenever convenience demanded. I tried to focus on the beauty of the moment, the way the afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows and painted rainbow patterns across the marble floor, the way Victoria's veil caught the light as she turned to face Michael. But all I could think about was the conversation we'd had just 3 months ago, when she'd shown me the final seating chart and asked my opinion about the arrangement. "I put you in the front row, right behind Mom," she'd said, pointing to the carefully drawn diagram spread across her kitchen table. "That way you'll be perfectly positioned for photos, and you can help me with my train if needed during the ceremony." "Perfect," I'd replied, feeling a warm glow of inclusion and importance. "I'm so honored to be part of your special day, Vic," she'd hugged me then, the same enthusiastic squeeze she'd been giving me since childhood. "I can't imagine getting married without my big sister right there with me. You're the most important person in my life, Nicole. I hope you know that." Those words felt like cruel fiction now, a performance she'd been giving to keep me compliant and helpful during the months of wedding planning. Had she known even then that she planned to exclude me from the real family photos? Had every conversation about our sisterly bond been a manipulation designed to ensure I'd continue investing my time and money in her perfect day? The ceremony continued with readings about love and faithfulness, each word twisting the knife a little deeper. Victoria's college roommate read from Corinthians about love being patient and kind, never keeping a record of wrongs. Michael's brother shared a poem about the blessing of family, about how the people who love you become your true home regardless of where you started in life. The cruel irony of that particular selection was almost too much to bear. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, a part of me wanted to stand up and speak the truth about what I'd just witnessed. Not to stop the wedding, but to make everyone in that chapel confront the ugliness that had just played out in front of them. Instead, I sat in silence like everyone else, complicit in the collective decision to pretend that what had happened was somehow acceptable. Victoria and Michael exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to support each other's families and to build a home based on love and acceptance. Victoria's voice was clear and confident as she spoke about how grateful she was for all the people who had shaped her into the woman she was becoming. She thanked Michael for welcoming her into his family with such warmth and generosity. She spoke about the importance of choosing love over fear, of building bridges instead of walls. Every word felt like a personal betrayal, a public contradiction of the private cruelty she'd just inflicted. I wondered how she could speak so eloquently about acceptance and bridge building while having just burned the most important bridge in her own life. Did she not see the hypocrisy, or had she simply decided that her relationship with me was acceptable collateral damage for the social status she was gaining through marriage? When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and invited Michael to kiss his bride, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Rice and flower petals filled the air as the newly married couple made their way back down the aisle, beaming with joy and satisfaction. Victoria's smile was radiant as she passed my row, but her eyes looked straight ahead, avoiding any direct contact with me. The recessional music swelled as the wedding party followed the couple out of the chapel. Victoria's 3 bridesmaids walked past me with sympathetic glances, their discomfort obvious but not strong enough to prompt any action on my behalf. They had known Victoria since college, but they were smart enough to recognize which side of this family conflict would be more beneficial to their long-term social standing. As the chapel began to empty, I remained seated in my back row, unsure of what came next. The reception was scheduled to begin in an hour with cocktails on the club's terrace overlooking the river. Was I still invited to that, or had my exile extended to the entire celebration? Grace Martinez appeared at my side again, her expression carefully neutral. "Nicole, the family is gathering for photos in the rose garden," she said quietly. "Victoria asked me to let you know that you're welcome to enjoy the cocktail hour while they finish with the formal pictures." The message was clear. I was being dismissed from the most important part of the wedding celebration, the moments that would be preserved forever in albums and frames. 23 years of sisterhood, reduced to an invitation to drink wine alone while the real family created memories without me. "Of course," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. "That makes perfect sense." Grace's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine sympathy. "Nicole, for what it's worth, I think your floral arrangements are the most beautiful I've ever seen at this venue. You have an incredible talent." Her kindness threatened to break through the careful emotional control I'd been maintaining. I thanked her quickly and made my way out of the chapel before the tears I'd been holding back could fall in such a public space. The late afternoon air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the nearby river and the changing leaves that decorated the club's extensive grounds. Under any other circumstances, it would have been a perfect day for a wedding celebration. I wandered through the club's gardens, avoiding the area where I knew the family photos were taking place. The sound of laughter and camera clicks drifted across the manicured lawns, punctuated by the photographer's directions and Victoria's delighted responses. I could picture the scene perfectly, generations of Harper and Chen family members arranged in elegant groupings, creating the kind of formal portraits that would grace mantelpieces and holiday cards for decades to come. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment I hoped it might be Victoria, having realized the magnitude of her mistake and wanting to make things right. Instead, it was from my mother, who had apparently witnessed the entire chapel humiliation but had remained silent throughout. "Honey, I'm so sorry about what happened in the chapel. Victoria is under a lot of stress today, and I think she just got overwhelmed by all the family expectations. Let's talk after the reception." The message was perfectly crafted to minimize Victoria's cruelty while avoiding any actual accountability. My mother had perfected the art of diplomatic neutrality during our childhood, always finding ways to explain away Victoria's more selfish moments without ever directly addressing the pattern of behavior. The fact that she had watched her daughter publicly humiliate her other daughter and responded with an excuse about wedding stress revealed everything I needed to know about where her loyalties truly lay. I deleted the message without responding and continued walking through the gardens, my expensive heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. The cocktail hour was beginning on the terrace, and I could hear the sound of conversation and clinking glasses mixing with the gentle jazz music the wedding planner had selected. I knew I should join the other guests, smile politely, and pretend that nothing unusual had happened. It was what good wedding guests did, what well-mannered people did when confronted with awkward family situations. Instead, I found myself gravitating toward the parking lot, my keys heavy in the small purse I'd carried to match my lavender dress. My Honda Civic looked distinctly out of place among the BMWs, Mercedes, and Tesla vehicles that filled the lot, a working-class reminder of the economic gulf between my life and the world Victoria was now entering. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent my savings making this wedding beautiful while surrounded by people for whom money was never a consideration. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, watching late-arriving guests hurry toward the reception while I tried to process what had just happened and what it meant for my future. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that this was just a terrible misunderstanding, that Victoria's wedding stress had temporarily overwhelmed her better judgment, that tomorrow we'd have a tearful conversation and everything would go back to normal. But a deeper, more honest part of me recognized that this moment had simply revealed truths that had been building for years. The subtle comments about my not understanding family traditions because of my adoption. The way Victoria had started introducing me as her adopted sister, rather than just her sister in recent years. The growing distance between us as her relationship with Michael had become more serious and his family's influence had become stronger. Today's public rejection wasn't an aberration driven by wedding stress. It was the culmination of a gradual process in which Victoria had been redefining our relationship according to new social priorities and expectations. The woman who had once promised to love me like a blood sister had decided that actual blood mattered more than shared history, more than genuine affection, more than the countless ways we had supported each other through every challenge life had presented. My phone rang, interrupting my dark thoughts. The caller ID showed David Rodriguez, my closest friend from work and the person I'd asked to cover my project responsibilities during the wedding weekend. David was one of the few people who knew how much emotional and financial investment I'd made in Victoria's wedding, and he'd been incredibly supportive throughout the months of planning. "Hey Nicole," his familiar voice was warm with concern. "I just wanted to check in and see how the wedding went. Everything okay? You sound strange." "It's complicated," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. The ceremony was beautiful. Victoria looked perfect. Everything went exactly as she planned. But David had known me long enough to hear the pain I was trying to hide. "But I think I just learned that love isn't always enough to make someone family," I replied, the words coming out more honestly than I'd intended. There was a pause as David processed this cryptic response. "Nicole, what happened? Are you okay? Do you need me to come pick you up?" The offer of rescue was tempting, but I knew I needed to see this day through to its end. Running away from the reception would only give Victoria more ammunition for her narrative about my being dramatic and overly sensitive. If our relationship was truly over, I wanted to end it with dignity intact. "I'm okay," I lied. "Just some family drama that I need to work through. I'll call you tomorrow and explain everything." "Are you sure?" "I can be there in 20 minutes. "I'm sure. Thank you, though. It means everything to know that someone cares enough to offer." After ending the call, I checked my appearance in the rearview mirror and attempted to repair the damage that tears and stress had done to my carefully applied makeup. My reflection looked tired and sad, but presentable enough for the social performance I still needed to complete. I walked back toward the reception with the kind of determined composure that had gotten me through every difficult situation in my adult life. The cocktail hour was in full swing when I arrived at the terrace. Guests clustered in elegant conversation groups, wine glasses and appetizer plates in hand as they enjoyed the spectacular view of the Willamette River and the distant mountains. The late afternoon light was golden and perfect, exactly the kind of romantic atmosphere Victoria had dreamed of for her wedding celebration. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and positioned myself near the edge of the terrace, close enough to appear social but far enough from the main action to avoid awkward conversations about my earlier exile. Several guests nodded politely in my direction, but no one approached me directly. Word of the chapel incident had apparently spread through the social network with the efficiency that embarrassing family moments always seem to achieve. Victoria held court near the center of the terrace, still in her stunning wedding gown but now relaxed and animated as she accepted congratulations and compliments from the assembled guests. Michael stood beside her, one hand resting protectively on her waist, his smile genuine as he thanked people for sharing their special day. They looked like the perfect young couple, successful and attractive and surrounded by love and support. Watching them, I felt a strange sense of disconnection, as if I were observing someone else's life from a great distance. This was the sister I'd shared a bedroom with for 15 years, the person who'd known all my secrets and dreams, the woman I'd considered my best friend and closest confidant. Now she felt like a beautiful stranger, someone I'd once known well but who had become someone else entirely. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the past year helping Victoria plan what she called the most important day of her life, sacrificing my time and money and emotional energy to ensure her happiness. In return, she'd given me a masterclass in conditional love, demonstrating that family bonds could be severed as easily as changing a seating chart. As the cocktail hour wound down and guests began moving toward the dining room for dinner, I realized that my invitation to this part of the celebration was probably another courtesy extended out of social obligation rather than genuine desire for my company. The seating chart Victoria had shown me months ago had placed me at the head table with the rest of the wedding party. I wondered where I would be seated now, or if I would be seated at all. Grace Martinez approached me as the terrace began to empty, her expression carefully professional but her eyes kind. "Nicole, I wanted to let you know that we've made some adjustments to the dining arrangements. You'll be at table 12, near the windows. It has a lovely view of the gardens." Table 12. I didn't need to see the seating chart to know that this was probably one of the furthest tables from the head table, likely populated with distant relatives and plus ones who didn't know anyone else at the wedding. Another subtle message about my newly reduced status in the family hierarchy. "Thank you," I said to Grace, managing a smile that probably didn't fool either of us. "I appreciate all your help today." She squeezed my arm gently before hurrying off to manage some other aspect of the reception logistics. Her small gesture of human kindness in the midst of such calculated cruelty was almost enough to break down the emotional walls I'd been carefully maintaining all day. The dining room was spectacular, transformed with soft lighting, elegant linens, and my carefully crafted floral centerpieces into the kind of romantic ballroom Victoria had always dreamed of for her wedding reception. Round tables surrounded a dance floor that gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows provided dramatic views of the river and the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. I found table 12 tucked into a corner near the kitchen doors, far from both the head table and the dance floor. My table mates were a collection of people who seemed as confused about their seating assignment as I was: Michael's great-aunt from California, a couple who appeared to be family friends rather than close relatives, and Danny, the teenage cousin who had also been relegated to the back of the chapel earlier. Danny looked as uncomfortable as I felt, his face still flushed with the embarrassment of our shared public rejection. "This is pretty weird, right?" he whispered as I took the seat beside him. "I mean, I've never been to a wedding where they made such a big deal about who was adopted and who wasn't." His frank acknowledgement of the elephant in the room was oddly comforting. "It's definitely not traditional wedding etiquette," I agreed quietly. "How are you holding up?" "I keep thinking about what my mom would say if she knew how Uncle Thomas and Victoria treated us today," he replied, his voice low enough that the other tablemates couldn't hear. "She always taught me that family is family, regardless of how you got there." His mother's wisdom stood in stark contrast to the philosophy that had governed today's events. I found myself wondering how many other families struggled with similar tensions between biological connections and chosen bonds, between traditional definitions of kinship and the more expansive understanding of love that includes adoption, remarriage, and all the other ways people create meaningful relationships. The dinner proceeded with the typical wedding reception schedule of speeches, toasts, and traditional celebrations. Victoria's maid of honor, her college roommate Sarah, gave a touching speech about their friendship and Victoria's journey to finding true love with Michael. She spoke eloquently about the importance of family, about how Victoria's loving nature had always drawn people to her and created lasting bonds with everyone in her life. The irony of that particular characterization was almost too much to bear. I watched Victoria beam with pleasure at Sarah's words, nodding enthusiastically as if she truly believed that she was someone who created lasting bonds with everyone in her life. Perhaps in her mind, she had created a lasting bond with me, one that simply required me to accept a permanently diminished role in exchange for continued access to family events. Michael's best man spoke next, sharing stories about their college friendship and praising Victoria for bringing out the best in Michael. He mentioned how excited Michael's family was to welcome Victoria into the Chen family circle, how her warmth and grace had immediately won over even the most traditional relatives. The speech painted a picture of seamless family integration, of a woman who had effortlessly earned her place in a close-knit family structure. Listening to these glowing descriptions of my sister's character while sitting in exile at table 12 felt surreal, like hearing someone describe a completely different person than the one who had publicly humiliated me just hours earlier. But I recognized that this was how family dynamics often worked. The public narrative rarely reflected the private realities, and everyone had a vested interest in maintaining the fiction that everything was harmonious and loving. When it came time for the traditional father-daughter dance, I watched Victoria glide across the dance floor in our stepfather's arms, her face glowing with happiness and satisfaction. Robert had raised both of us from early childhood, treating me with exactly the same love and attention he gave to Victoria. The fact that he had stood silent during the chapel incident and was now participating normally in the reception felt like another small betrayal, another confirmation that family loyalty followed bloodlines when push came to shove. The evening continued with the usual wedding festivities, cake cutting, bouquet toss, and dancing that gradually became more informal and energetic as the open bar took effect. I participated when social expectations required it, applauding during the cake cutting and even joining the group of single women who gathered for the bouquet toss, though I made sure to position myself where there was no chance I would actually catch it. Victoria's bouquet sailed through the air in a perfect arc, caught by one of her bridesmaids amid squeals of delight and predictions about the next wedding in the friend group. As the crowd dispersed and the dancing resumed, Victoria made her way over to my corner table for the first direct interaction we'd had since the chapel incident. "Nicole," she said, slightly breathless from dancing, her wedding dress now showing the gentle wear of a long celebration. "I'm so glad you stayed for the whole reception. It means a lot to me that you're here." Her casual tone suggested that she expected our conversation to proceed as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the chapel humiliation had been a minor logistical adjustment rather than a fundamental rejection of our relationship. The disconnect between her perception and reality was so profound that I almost couldn't find words to respond. "It's been a beautiful wedding, Victoria," I managed to say, my voice carefully neutral. "Everything turned out exactly as you planned." "It really did," she agreed, missing or choosing to ignore the subtle edge in my tone. "And your flowers have been absolutely perfect. Everyone keeps commenting on how gorgeous the arrangements are." She spoke as if my floral contribution had been a hired service rather than a labor of love, as if the months of work and financial sacrifice had been a professional transaction rather than the gift of a devoted sister. The casual dismissal of my emotional investment felt almost worse than the original rejection. "I'm glad they met your expectations," I replied, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, perhaps finally registering that this conversation wasn't proceeding with the warmth she'd expected. "Nicole, I hope you understand that today's arrangements weren't personal. Michael's family has certain expectations about tradition and propriety, and as his wife, I need to honor those expectations." Her explanation painted me as an obstacle to her social advancement, a complication that needed to be managed rather than a person whose feelings mattered. The fact that she could frame my public humiliation as a reasonable accommodation to someone else's prejudices revealed how completely she had internalized her new family's value system. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "Family expectations are clearly very important to you." Something in my tone finally seemed to penetrate her self-satisfaction. "Nicole, you're being dramatic about this. Nothing fundamental has changed between us. You're still my sister, and I still love you. This was just about managing a complicated social situation on my wedding day." "Managing a complicated social situation," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air between us. "Is that what you call our relationship now?" Victoria's face flushed slightly, the first sign of genuine discomfort she'd shown all day. You're twisting my words. You know that's not what I meant. Actually, I think it's exactly what you meant, I replied, standing up from the table. And I think it's probably the most honest thing you've said to me in months. Before she could respond, I walked away from the table and toward the exit, my head held high and my pace steady despite the trembling in my legs. Behind me, I could hear Victoria calling my name, but I didn't turn around. Some conversations had natural endpoints, and this one had reached ours. The cool evening air hit my face as I stepped outside the country club, carrying the scent of the nearby river and the promise of rain later in the night. My car was one of the few remaining in the parking lot, a lonely reminder of how thoroughly I'd been excluded from the inner circle of this celebration. As I drove through the quiet Portland streets toward home, I realized that this day had marked the end of more than just Victoria's single life. It had marked the end of my belief that love and loyalty were enough to guarantee your place in someone's heart, and the beginning of a much harder understanding about how conditional family relationships could be when social pressure and personal ambition came into play. The road ahead stretched dark and uncertain, lit only by streetlights and the distant glow of the city. But for the first time all day, I felt like I was heading towards something honest rather than running away from something painful. Whatever came next, at least I would face it with my dignity intact and my illusions finally put to rest. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that made Portland famous, the sky weeping gentle tears that matched my internal weather perfectly. I sat in my Honda Civic in the parking garage beneath Chen Industries, staring at the concrete wall ahead of me while rain drummed softly against the windshield. My weekend had been a blur of tear-stained tissues, unanswered phone calls from my mother, and the strange hollow feeling that comes when something you've believed in for your entire life suddenly reveals itself to be an illusion. The Chen Industries building rose 32 stories above downtown Portland, its glass and steel facade reflecting the moody Pacific Northwest sky like a mirror. I'd been working here for 3 years, ever since graduating from Portland State with my project management degree, and the familiarity of my routine usually provided comfort during difficult times. But today, even the prospect of losing myself in spreadsheets and construction timelines felt overwhelming. My phone buzzed with another text from Victoria, the 7th since Saturday night. Nicole, please call me. We need to talk about what happened. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. The message followed the same pattern as all the others, carefully crafted to suggest that the problem was my perception rather than her actions, that reasonable people could surely work through this minor bump in our relationship. I deleted the message without responding, just as I had with all the others. The word misunderstanding particularly galled me. There had been no misunderstanding about her announcement in the chapel, no ambiguity in her decision to exile me to the back row, no confusion about her priorities when family loyalty came into conflict with social advancement. Victoria had made her choices with perfect clarity, and now she was discovering that choices had consequences. David Rodriguez was already at his desk when I arrived at the project coordination office on the 15th floor, despite the early hour. He looked up from his computer screen with the expression of someone who had been waiting anxiously for me to arrive, his dark eyes filled with concern and barely contained curiosity about the cryptic conversation we'd had Saturday evening. "Good morning," he said carefully, his voice neutral enough to give me space to set the tone for whatever conversation might follow. "How was the rest of your weekend?" "Enlightening," I replied, hanging my jacket on the back of my chair and powering up my computer with movements that were probably more forceful than necessary. I learned some valuable lessons about family dynamics and social hierarchies. David had worked with me long enough to recognize when I was using professional language to mask personal pain. He pushed back from his desk and rolled his chair closer to mine, lowering his voice despite the fact that we were the only people in the office at this early hour. "Nicole, what really happened at that wedding? And don't give me another diplomatic non-answer. Something serious went down, and you've been carrying it alone since Saturday." The genuine concern in his voice threatened to crack the careful emotional control I'd been maintaining since driving home from the country club. David was one of the few people at Chen Industries who knew about my personal life beyond the basic biographical details that appeared on employment forms. Over the past 3 years, we developed the kind of friendship that emerged naturally when two people worked closely together on high-pressure projects and discovered they could trust each other with both professional challenges and personal struggles. Victoria decided that adopted family members should sit in the back at her wedding, I said quietly, the words feeling strange and clinical as I spoke them aloud. Apparently, her new in-laws have some traditional ideas about family authenticity, and she chose to accommodate those ideas rather than defend her relationship with me. David's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger on my behalf. She what? Nicole, please tell me you're exaggerating. Please tell me your sister didn't publicly humiliate you at her own wedding. I wish I was exaggerating. I turned my attention to my computer screen, pulling up the project files for a downtown hotel renovation that was scheduled to begin construction the following month. But apparently, when push comes to shove, blood really is thicker than water. Or in this case, thicker than 23 years of shared history. That's absolutely unforgivable, David said, his voice tight with indignation. I don't care what kind of family pressure she was under. You don't treat your sister like that, especially not in front of 200 people. His outrage was comforting, a validation that my feelings of betrayal and hurt were justified rather than the overreaction Victoria's text messages seemed to suggest. But it also made the situation feel more real, more final. As long as I was the only one who fully understood what had happened, I could maintain some hope that I was misinterpreting the events or that Victoria would somehow make things right. David's clear moral judgment made it harder to cling to those comforting delusions. The worst part, I continued, opening a spreadsheet of construction timelines that suddenly seemed impossibly complex, is that I saw it coming. There were signs for months that her priorities were shifting, that her relationship with Michael's family was changing how she thought about our relationship. But I kept telling myself that our bond was stronger than social pressure. You shouldn't have had to see it coming, David replied firmly. Family shouldn't be conditional. The fact that you were looking for warning signs means the foundation was already cracked. We worked in relative silence for the next hour, the normal bustle of office activity gradually filling the space around us as other employees arrived for the workday. I threw myself into project details with the kind of intense focus that had always been my refuge during emotional storms. Construction schedules and budget analyses were concrete problems with logical solutions, unlike family relationships that seemed to operate according to rules I'd never fully understood. Around 10 a.m., my desk phone rang with an internal call. The caller ID showed an extension I didn't recognize, but the administrative assistant who spoke identified herself as calling from the executive floor. Nicole Harper. Mr. Thomas Chen would like to see you in his office at your earliest convenience. The request hit me like ice water. Thomas Chen was Michael's father, the CEO and founder of Chen Industries, the man whose traditional family values had apparently influenced Victoria's wedding day decisions. In 3 years of working for the company, I'd never had any direct interaction with him beyond passing him occasionally in the elevator or lobby. Project coordinators at my level simply didn't move in the same corporate circles as C-suite executives. Did he say what this was regarding? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. He didn't provide details, but he asked me to emphasize that this was a personal matter rather than a professional issue. A personal matter. The phrase confirmed my worst fears about why Thomas Chen might suddenly want to meet with me. Someone had clearly informed him about the awkward family dynamics that had played out at his son's wedding, and now he wanted to address the situation directly. I wondered if Victoria had complained to Michael about my dramatic exit from the reception, if Michael had shared those concerns with his father, if this meeting was meant to ensure that workplace harmony wasn't disrupted by family conflicts. I'll be up in 15 minutes, I told the assistant, my voice steady despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. David looked up from his computer with raised eyebrows. Thomas Chen wants to see you? The big boss himself? What's that about? Wedding fallout, I replied grimly, straightening my blouse and checking my reflection in my phone screen. Apparently, Victoria's in-laws want to have a conversation about family boundaries and professional conduct. That seems like a massive overreach, David said, his expression darkening. Your personal relationship with your sister has nothing to do with your job performance here. Maybe not, but Thomas Chen signs my paychecks, and Michael is his son. If they've decided that I'm a potential source of drama or embarrassment, they have every right to address that concern. The executive floor occupied the top 3 levels of the Chen Industries building, accessible only by a special elevator that required key card access. As I rode up from the 15th floor, I tried to prepare myself for what was likely to be an extremely uncomfortable conversation about maintaining professional boundaries and keeping family conflicts out of the workplace. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel, all polished marble and tasteful artwork that probably cost more than my annual salary. Thomas Chen's administrative assistant, an elegant woman in her 50s who radiated the kind of professional competence that made billion-dollar companies run smoothly, greeted me with a warm but carefully neutral smile. "Miss Harper, thank you for coming up so quickly. Mr. Chen is ready to see you now." She led me through a corridor lined with photographs documenting Chen Industries' 30-year history, images of groundbreaking ceremonies and ribbon cuttings and architectural awards that told the story of a company built from immigrant ambition into Pacific Northwest prominence. At the end of the corridor, massive oak doors opened into a corner office that commanded spectacular views of Portland's skyline and the distant Mount Hood. Thomas Chen rose from behind a desk that probably cost more than my car, his expression serious but not unkind. He was exactly as I remembered from the wedding weekend, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that filled whatever space he occupied. But something in his demeanor seemed different, less formal than the social interactions we'd had at the rehearsal dinner and reception. "Miss Harper, please have a seat," he said, gesturing toward a pair of leather chairs arranged near the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Thank you for coming up on short notice. I realize this is probably an unusual request." I settled into one of the chairs, my hands folded carefully in my lap, and waited for him to explain why the CEO of a major construction company wanted to discuss my personal family dynamics. The silence stretched for several seconds as he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to speak with you about what happened at my son's wedding," he began, his voice measured and deliberate. "I understand there was some difficulty regarding family seating arrangements." "There was," I replied simply, not sure how much detail he wanted or how defensive I should be about my behavior. He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more intense. "Miss Harper, I want you to know that what happened in that chapel was not something I endorsed or encouraged. In fact, I was deeply disturbed by the entire situation." His statement caught me completely off guard. Based on Victoria's explanation about honoring Michael's family traditions, I had assumed that Thomas Chen was the driving force behind the decision to exile adopted family members from the formal ceremony and photos. The idea that he had been upset rather than pleased by those arrangements didn't fit the narrative I'd constructed about family pressure and social expectations. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. "Victoria mentioned that your family had certain traditional expectations about wedding ceremonies and family representation." Thomas Chen's expression hardened, but the anger seemed to be directed at something other than my presence in his office. "Miss Harper, I built this company from nothing after my parents immigrated from Taiwan with 2 suitcases and a determination to create better opportunities for their children. I understand exactly what it means to be treated as an outsider, to have your place in a family or community questioned because of circumstances beyond your control." He stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he looked out at the city skyline. "My daughter-in-law made those seating decisions without consulting me or my wife. If she had, we would have told her that kindness and inclusion matter more than bloodlines, that the strength of a family is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable members, not by how perfectly it conforms to social expectations." The relief that flooded through me was so intense it was almost dizzying. For 3 days, I'd been torturing myself with questions about whether I'd overreacted to a reasonable accommodation, whether my hurt feelings were justified, whether I'd been selfish to expect equal treatment at Victoria's wedding. Having Thomas Chen, the person I'd believed was responsible for my humiliation, instead validate my feelings felt like an unexpected gift. "Miss Harper," he continued, turning back to face me, "I want to apologize for what you experienced at my son's wedding. No one should be made to feel excluded from their own family, regardless of how that family was formed." "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. "That means more than you know." He returned to his chair, his expression becoming more businesslike but retaining its underlying warmth. "I also want you to know that your work here at Chen Industries has been exemplary. Your project coordination on the waterfront district development was particularly impressive, and several of our major clients have specifically requested your involvement in future projects." The praise felt surreal coming so quickly after the personal validation. I'd been so focused on the family drama that I hadn't considered how workplace dynamics might be affected by my connection to the Chen family through Victoria's marriage. The idea that Thomas Chen not only knew who I was professionally but had been following my work performance was both flattering and slightly intimidating. "I appreciate that feedback," I said. "I love what I do here, and I've always tried to give my best effort to every project." "It shows," he replied. "Which brings me to why I really asked you here today. I have a proposition for you, though I want you to understand that it has nothing to do with your relationship to my daughter-in-law and everything to do with your qualifications and potential." A proposition from the CEO was not what I'd expected when his assistant had called that morning. I waited for him to continue, my curiosity overriding the lingering anxiety about this unexpected meeting. "Chen Industries is expanding our community development division," he explained, pulling a folder from his desk and handing it to me. "We're launching a new initiative focused on affordable housing and community revitalization projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. It's work that requires someone with strong project management skills, attention to detail, and a genuine understanding of what it means to build inclusive communities." I opened the folder to find a detailed job description for a senior project manager position that would involve overseeing multiple construction projects designed to create affordable housing options for families, seniors, and individuals transitioning out of difficult circumstances. The scope of responsibility was significantly larger than my current role, with a salary increase that would substantially improve my financial security. "This position would report directly to me," Thomas Chen continued, "and would involve extensive travel throughout Oregon and Washington to oversee various project sites. It's challenging work that requires someone who can navigate complex community dynamics while maintaining the highest standards of professional excellence." The offer was extraordinary, far beyond anything I could have expected at this stage of my career. But the timing made it feel complicated, tangled up with family drama and personal emotions in ways that made it difficult to evaluate purely on its professional merits. "Mr. Chen," I said slowly, "this is an incredible opportunity, but I have to ask, does this have anything to do with what happened at the wedding? Because if you're offering this position because you feel guilty about Victoria's behavior, I can't accept it." His smile was the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him since arriving in his office. "Ms. Harper, I've been planning to create this position for 6 months, long before I knew you were connected to my family through marriage. The timing of this conversation is related to the wedding, but only because it made me realize that I needed to have this discussion with you sooner rather than later." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "What happened at that wedding reminded me why this type of work matters. Building inclusive communities isn't just about constructing affordable housing units. It's about creating spaces where everyone belongs, where people don't have to worry about being excluded or devalued because of their background or circumstances." The connection between his community development vision and my personal experience of exclusion was clear, but it didn't feel manipulative or patronizing. Instead, it seemed like the kind of authentic leadership that recognized how personal experiences could inform professional purpose. "The fact that you understand what exclusion feels like, that you've experienced firsthand how devastating it can be when institutions or families create arbitrary hierarchies of belonging, makes you exactly the right person for this work," he continued. "I need someone who will fight for inclusive practices not because it's a corporate policy, but because they understand why inclusion matters." I looked down at the job description again, reading through details about budget management, community partnerships, and construction oversight. It was exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing when I'd first started studying project management, meaningful work that would make a tangible difference in people's lives while challenging me to grow professionally. "Can I have some time to think about this?" I asked, though I was already leaning toward acceptance. "Of course," he replied. "But I hope you'll consider the position seriously. I believe you could make a significant impact in this role, and I think the work would be personally fulfilling in ways that your current position might not be." As I prepared to leave his office, Thomas Chen stood and extended his hand for a professional handshake. "Ms. Harper, regardless of what you decide about the job offer, I want you to know that what happened at the wedding was wrong. Family should be a source of support and acceptance, not conditional belonging based on arbitrary standards." His words felt like a benediction, a validation from an unexpected source that helped heal some of the damage Victoria's rejection had caused. Walking back to the elevator, I felt lighter than I had in days, as if a weight I hadn't fully recognized had been lifted from my shoulders. The ride down to the 15th floor gave me time to process what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, my understanding of the wedding situation had been completely transformed. Thomas Chen hadn't been the traditional authoritarian father-in-law forcing his new daughter-in-law to exclude adopted family members. Instead, he was someone who understood exclusion personally and professionally, someone whose values aligned with inclusion and fairness rather than rigid social hierarchies. Which meant that Victoria's decision to humiliate me had been her own choice, not a reluctant accommodation to family pressure. She had used Thomas Chen's supposed traditionalism as an excuse for behavior that reflected her own priorities and prejudices, not his. David looked up expectantly when I returned to my desk, clearly curious about the outcome of such an unusual summons to the executive floor. Well? Are you in trouble? Did they ask you to transfer to a different department to avoid family awkwardness? Actually, I said, settling back into my chair with a sense of disbelief about the morning's developments. Thomas Chen offered me a promotion. Senior Project Manager for a new community development initiative. David's eyebrows shot up in surprise. A promotion? From the CEO himself? That's not what I expected to hear. It gets better, I continued, pulling up my email to find a formal job offer that had already been sent while I was in the elevator. He also apologized for what happened at the wedding and made it clear that Victoria's behavior wasn't something he endorsed or encouraged. Wait, David said, rolling his chair closer to my desk again. Are you telling me that the person Victoria claimed was forcing her to exclude adopted family members actually disagrees with that decision? That's exactly what I'm telling you. I forwarded the job offer email to my personal account so I could review it more carefully at home. Apparently, Victoria's explanation about family pressure was just a convenient excuse for her own choices. The implications of this revelation were still sinking in. If Thomas Chen hadn't been pressuring Victoria to exclude me from the wedding ceremony and photos, then her decision had been motivated by her own discomfort with our family dynamic, her own desire to present a certain image to her new social circle, her own willingness to sacrifice our relationship for the sake of appearance and convenience. That makes it so much worse, David said quietly. At least if she'd been pressured by his family, you could understand why she felt conflicted. But if this was just her own decision, then she chose to humiliate me because she wanted to, not because she had to, I finished. Which means our relationship was never as important to her as I thought it was. The afternoon passed in a blur of routine work tasks, but my mind kept returning to the conversation with Thomas Chen and what it meant for my understanding of the weekend's events. Every text message from Victoria, every voicemail from my mother asking me to be reasonable about the wedding situation, every assumption I'd made about family pressure and social expectations had been based on a false premise. Around 4 p.m., my desk phone rang with another internal call. This time, the caller ID showed an extension from the legal department, which sent a fresh spike of anxiety through my chest. Had someone complained about my meeting with Thomas Chen? Were there concerns about potential conflicts of interest if I accepted the promotion? Nicole Harper speaking, I answered carefully. Hi Nicole, this is Jennifer Walsh from Legal. I'm calling about some paperwork we need you to review related to a potential position change. Do you have a few minutes to come down to the 20th floor? The legal review seemed routine, probably standard procedure for any significant promotion within the company. I made my way to the 20th floor, where Jennifer Walsh, a friendly attorney in her 40s, was waiting with a stack of documents that needed my signature. Congratulations on the promotion, she said warmly as I settled into a chair across from her desk. Community development is such important work, and Mr. Chen speaks very highly of your qualifications. Thank you, I replied, still adjusting to the idea that my professional reputation had been noticed at the highest levels of the company. Before we go through these employment documents, Jennifer continued, I want to make sure you understand the reporting structure for this position. As Senior Project Manager for Community Development, you would report directly to Thomas Chen, but you would also have dotted line responsibility to Michael Chen as he takes on more operational oversight of the company. The mention of Michael's name brought the family complications rushing back. Working closely with Victoria's new husband would create ongoing opportunities for awkwardness and tension, especially if their marriage had been damaged by the weekend's events. I wondered if Michael was aware of his father's job offer, if he supported the decision, or if he had concerns about mixing family dynamics with business operations. "Has Michael been informed about this position?" I asked. "Actually," Jennifer said with a slight smile, "the community development initiative was originally his idea. He's been advocating for this type of program for over a year, arguing that Chen Industries should use its success to give back to the community in more meaningful ways." This information added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. If Michael had been the driving force behind the community development program, then accepting the position would mean working closely with someone whose personal life was now entangled with the sister who had just publicly rejected me. "I realize this creates some unique challenges," Jennifer continued, clearly aware of the family connections involved. "But Mr. Chen Sr. was very specific that your qualifications for this position have nothing to do with your relationship to the family, and everything to do with your professional capabilities." As I reviewed and signed the various employment documents, I found myself thinking about the strange turns my life had taken in just a few days. Saturday morning, I'd been Victoria's devoted sister, financially and emotionally invested in her happiness, confident in my place within our family structure. Now, less than a week later, that family relationship was in ruins, but I'd been offered professional opportunities that could transform my career and allow me to do work that truly mattered. "There's one more thing," Jennifer said as I finished with the paperwork. "Mr. Chen wanted me to give you this." She handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Thomas Chen's careful handwriting. Inside was a brief note that made my throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Ms. Harper," the note read, "I want you to know that your grace and dignity during a very difficult situation have impressed me more than any professional accomplishment ever could. The way you conducted yourself at the wedding, despite being treated poorly, showed me the kind of character that can't be taught or faked. That character, combined with your professional skills, is exactly what this company needs as we expand our community impact. I hope you'll accept this position and help us build something meaningful together. Thomas Chen." Walking back to my desk with the signed employment agreements, I felt a strange sense of closure about the weekend's events. The validation from Thomas Chen couldn't undo the hurt Victoria had caused or restore the trust that had been broken between us. But it provided a different framework for understanding what had happened and what it meant for my future. The people who truly understood the value of character and kindness had noticed my behavior under pressure and found it worthy of respect. The person who should have valued those qualities most had instead chosen to prioritize appearance over substance, social advancement over family loyalty, convenience over compassion. As David often said when we encountered difficult clients or challenging project obstacles, sometimes the trash takes itself out. Victoria had shown me exactly who she was when the stakes were high and the pressure was on. That revelation was painful, but it was also liberating in ways I was just beginning to understand. The rain had stopped by the time I left the Chen Industries building that evening, and patches of blue sky were beginning to appear between the dissipating clouds. Portland looked clean and fresh after the morning storm, the city lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled over the Pacific Northwest. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine, processing the day's unexpected developments and trying to understand how much my life had changed in the span of a few hours. My phone buzzed with yet another text from Victoria, this one longer and more desperate than the others. "Nicole, please stop ignoring my calls. I know you're hurt, but you're blowing this completely out of proportion. It was one day, one decision that I had to make under pressure. Our entire relationship can't be destroyed by a single mistake. Please call me so we can work this out like adults." But as I drove home through the familiar Portland neighborhoods, past the coffee shops and bookstores and food trucks that made this city feel like home, I realized that Victoria still didn't understand what had actually happened at her wedding. She thought the problem was my sensitivity to a minor social snub, not her fundamental betrayal of everything our relationship had supposedly meant. Real families didn't rank their members according to biological authenticity. Real sisters didn't sacrifice each other for social advancement. Real love didn't come with conditions that could be revoked when convenience demanded it. Victoria had taught me these lessons the hard way, but she had taught them thoroughly. And sometimes the most painful lessons were also the most valuable ones, especially when they came with unexpected opportunities to build something better from the wreckage of what you thought you wanted. The evening ahead stretched before me with a sense of possibility that had been absent for months. For the first time since beginning my intensive wedding preparations, I had an entire night with no floral arrangements to create, no vendor calls to return, no sister to please. Instead, I had a job offer to consider, a future to imagine, and the beginning of a new understanding about what family really meant when it was based on choice rather than obligation. The Monday morning 6 weeks after Victoria's wedding dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. I stood in my new corner office on the 28th floor of the Chen Industries building, watching the sunrise paint Mount Hood in shades of gold and pink while sipping coffee from a mug that read, Senior Project Manager, Community Development. The view from this height was spectacular, encompassing the Willamette River, the downtown skyline, and the rolling hills that stretched toward the coast. My transformation from a cubicle-bound project coordinator to a senior executive with my own office, administrative assistant, and six-figure salary still felt surreal some mornings. The promotion had officially taken effect 3 weeks ago, but every day brought new responsibilities and challenges that reminded me how dramatically my professional life had changed. The Community Development Initiative was ambitious in scope, involving the construction of affordable housing complexes in 12 different cities throughout Oregon and Washington, each project requiring careful coordination between construction teams, local government officials, and community organizations. The work was exactly as fulfilling as Thomas Chen had predicted. Each project site I visited introduced me to families who were struggling to find safe, affordable housing in communities where gentrification and rising property values had pushed them to the margins. The Riverside Gardens complex in Gresham would provide homes for senior citizens living on fixed incomes. The Harmony Village development in Tacoma was designed specifically for single mothers transitioning out of domestic violence situations. The Cedar Heights project in Eugene would create accessible housing options for individuals with disabilities who wanted to live independently. Every project felt personal in ways that my previous work had not. When I met with construction supervisors to review building timelines, I thought about the families who were waiting for these homes to be completed. When I negotiated with suppliers to keep costs within budget, I knew that every dollar saved could be redirected toward additional units or improved amenities. When I worked with community organizations to develop support services for future residents, I understood that we were creating more than just buildings. We were building foundations for people to rebuild their lives. My administrative assistant, Karen Thompson, knocked on my office door and entered with the kind of professional efficiency that made impossible schedules manageable. Karen had worked at Chen Industries for 8 years and had specifically requested to be assigned to the Community Development Division because she believed in the mission. Her organizational skills were legendary throughout the company, and her ability to coordinate complex logistics across multiple project sites had already proven invaluable. "Good morning, Nicole," she said, settling into one of the chairs across from my desk with a tablet full of the day's priorities. "I have your schedule confirmed for the site visits in Salem and Corvallis, but there's been an interesting development with the Portland City Council presentation." The Portland City Council presentation was scheduled for the following week, part of Chen Industries' effort to secure approval for a major affordable housing development in the Alberta district. The project had been controversial from the beginning, with some community members expressing concern about gentrification and corporate involvement in neighborhood development. My job was to present the community benefits of the project while addressing legitimate concerns about preserving the area's cultural identity and ensuring that current residents wouldn't be displaced by rising property values. "What kind of development?" I asked, taking a seat across from Karen and preparing to adjust whatever scheduling complications had arisen. "The City Council specifically requested that you lead the entire presentation," Karen replied, her expression suggesting that this was significant news. Originally, they were expecting Michael Chen to present on behalf of the company, but apparently several council members have heard about your work on the other community development projects and want to hear directly from you about the Alberta District proposal. The news was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Public presentations to city councils were high-stakes events that could determine whether multi-million-dollar projects received approval or were rejected entirely. The fact that Portland's City Council had specifically requested my involvement suggested that my work was gaining recognition beyond Chen Industries, but it also meant that the responsibility for the project's success rested squarely on my shoulders. "Did they give any indication about why they specifically want to hear from me?" I asked. Karen consulted her notes with a slight smile. Councilwoman Rodriguez mentioned that she'd heard you had a unique perspective on community inclusion and that your background made you particularly qualified to address concerns about corporate development projects displacing vulnerable residents. The irony of being praised for my understanding of inclusion and displacement wasn't lost on me. 6 weeks ago, I'd been publicly excluded from my own sister's family photos because my adoption supposedly made me less authentically family. Now, my experience of exclusion was being recognized as a professional asset that qualified me to advocate for marginalized communities. The symmetry was almost poetic. My desk phone rang with a call from Michael Chen, my direct supervisor and the operational overseer of the Community Development Initiative. Working with Victoria's new husband had been less awkward than I'd anticipated, partly because Michael seemed genuinely committed to the mission of the projects and partly because he'd never directly addressed the wedding situation. Our professional relationship was cordial and productive, focused entirely on project goals and community outcomes. Nicole, do you have a few minutes to discuss the Portland presentation? Michael's voice was crisp and businesslike, as it always was during our work conversations. Of course, I replied, putting the call on speaker so Karen could take notes if needed. I just got off the phone with Councilwoman Rodriguez, Michael continued. She's impressed with the community feedback we've received from the other project sites, and she wants to make sure the Portland project incorporates the same level of community input and cultural sensitivity. This was exactly the kind of challenge I'd hoped to tackle when accepting the position. The Alberta district had a rich history as one of Portland's most diverse neighborhoods, with a strong African American community that had been gradually displaced by gentrification over the past 2 decades. Any new development project needed to honor that history while providing genuine benefits to current residents rather than accelerating their displacement. I've been working with local community organizations to develop a comprehensive plan for resident input throughout the construction process, I said. The goal is to ensure that long-term residents have priority access to the new units and that local businesses benefit from the increased foot traffic and economic activity. That's exactly what the council wants to hear, Michael replied. But they're also concerned about corporate credibility. They want to know that Chen Industries is committed to these values long-term, not just for this particular project. The question of corporate credibility was legitimate and important. Too many companies had used community development projects as public relations opportunities without making genuine commitments to ongoing community support. The fact that Thomas Chen had created this initiative as a company-wide priority rather than a one-off charitable gesture was significant, but convincing skeptical community leaders required more than good intentions. I think our track record with the other projects speaks for itself, I said. The Gresham project came in under budget and ahead of schedule, and the resident satisfaction surveys have been overwhelmingly positive. The Tacoma project has a waiting list of over 200 applicants, which suggests that we're meeting real community needs. Agreed, Michael said. I think you're the right person to make this case to the council. Your perspective on community inclusion is exactly what they need to hear. After ending the call, I spent the rest of the morning reviewing project files and preparing talking points for the City Council presentation. The work required balancing multiple competing priorities: community concerns about gentrification, City Council requirements for economic development, Chen Industries' need for profitable projects, and my own commitment to creating genuinely beneficial outcomes for vulnerable residents. Around noon, Karen brought me a lunch salad and a stack of messages that had accumulated while I was focused on presentation preparation. Most were routine communications from contractors and community partners, but one message immediately caught my attention. Victoria had called and asked that I return her call at my earliest convenience regarding an important family matter. It was the first direct communication attempt from Victoria in over 2 weeks. After the initial barrage of texts and voicemails following the wedding, her efforts to contact me had gradually decreased in frequency and intensity. My mother had continued making occasional attempts to mediate the situation, usually with vague suggestions that both Victoria and I should try to see things from each other's perspective and not let one difficult day damage a lifetime relationship. But I'd maintained complete silence with Victoria throughout my professional transformation, partly because I was still processing my feelings about her betrayal and partly because my new responsibilities left little emotional energy for family drama. The timing of her renewed outreach felt suspicious, occurring just as news of my promotion and success had probably reached her through Portland's interconnected social networks. Did she say anything specific about what kind of family matter? I asked Karen, who had taken the message. She mentioned something about wanting to discuss misunderstandings and family reconciliation, Karen replied diplomatically. But she seemed quite insistent that it was urgent. The word misunderstandings irritated me just as much as it had in her text messages 6 weeks ago. Victoria's consistent framing of the wedding situation as a misunderstanding rather than a deliberate choice revealed either profound self-deception or calculated manipulation designed to minimize her responsibility for the consequences of her actions. I decided to focus on work rather than returning the call immediately. The Portland City Council presentation was genuinely important, affecting the housing prospects of hundreds of families who were struggling with affordability in an increasingly expensive city. Whatever Victoria's urgent family matter might be, it could wait until I'd completed my professional obligations. The afternoon was filled with meetings about construction timelines, budget revisions, and community outreach strategies. Each conversation reinforced how much I loved this work and how much personal satisfaction I derived from projects that made tangible differences in people's lives. The contrast between my current sense of purpose and the emotional turmoil that had characterized my life during Victoria's wedding planning was striking. Around 4 p.m., Karen informed me that Chen wanted to see me in his office to discuss the upcoming Portland presentation and some broader strategic questions about the Community Development Initiative's future. Walking to the executive floor had become routine over the past few weeks, but I still felt a sense of pride and accomplishment when the elevator doors opened onto the marble reception area that represented the pinnacle of corporate success. Chen greeted me with the warm professionalism that had characterized our working relationship since my promotion. His office felt more familiar now, though no less impressive with its commanding views and elegant furnishings. But what had once felt intimidating now felt comfortable, like entering the workspace of a mentor and colleague rather than an unreachable authority figure. "Nicole, thank you for coming up," he said, gesturing toward the seating area near the windows. "I wanted to discuss your Portland presentation, but I also have some broader questions about your vision for expanding the community development program." We spent 20 minutes reviewing the details of the Alberta District project, discussing community concerns and strategic approaches for addressing City Council questions. Chen's insights were valuable, reflecting decades of experience navigating complex development projects and municipal politics. But what impressed me most was his genuine commitment to ensuring that the project succeeded as a community benefit rather than merely a profitable venture. "I've been watching your work over the past few weeks," he said as our conversation shifted to broader strategic questions. "Your approach to community engagement has exceeded even my optimistic expectations. The feedback we're receiving from residents and community partners is overwhelmingly positive." The praise felt earned rather than patronizing, based on measurable outcomes and concrete achievements rather than potential or good intentions. The Gresham project had indeed come in under budget and ahead of schedule, with resident satisfaction surveys showing approval ratings over 90%. The Tacoma project was progressing smoothly despite initial skepticism from local advocacy groups, who had become strong supporters after seeing our commitment to transparent communication and community input. "Thank you," I replied. "This work feels personally meaningful in ways that my previous projects didn't." When you can see the direct impact on individual families and communities, every detail matters more. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "That personal investment is exactly what makes the difference between successful community development and failed corporate charity projects. People can tell when you genuinely care about outcomes versus when you're just checking boxes for public relations purposes." He stood and walked to his desk, returning with a folder that contained documents I didn't recognize. "Which brings me to the main reason I wanted to speak with you today. I'd like to discuss the possibility of expanding your role and responsibilities within the company." The folder contained preliminary plans for a significant expansion of the Community Development Initiative, involving projects in California, Nevada, and potentially other Western states. The scope was ambitious, requiring the coordination of dozens of construction projects, hundreds of community partnerships, and millions of dollars in budget allocation. It was exactly the kind of challenge that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks ago but now felt like a natural progression from the work I was already doing. "This would be a vice president level position," Chen explained, "with full authority over the Community Development Division and direct input on company-wide strategic decisions related to social impact and community engagement." A vice president position at Chen Industries would represent the kind of career advancement that typically took decades to achieve, not weeks. The salary increase would be substantial, but more importantly, the role would give me the authority and resources to create programs that could affect thousands of families throughout the western United States. Mr. Chen, I said carefully, this is an incredible opportunity, but I want to make sure I understand the timeline and expectations clearly. Are you considering this promotion because of my work performance, or because you think it would address ongoing family complications related to Victoria and Michael? His expression became more serious, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. Nicole, I'm offering this position because your work has demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and vision that Chen Industries needs as we expand our community impact. The family connection is irrelevant to your professional qualifications. He paused, then continued with a slight smile. However, I will say that the way you've handled a difficult personal situation while maintaining complete professionalism has impressed everyone in the company who's worked with you. That kind of character and resilience is exactly what we need in executive leadership positions. The validation felt profound, representing a complete reversal from the humiliation and rejection I'd experienced at Victoria's wedding. The people who mattered professionally had noticed my response to adversity and found it worthy of respect and advancement. The person who should have valued those qualities most had instead chosen to exploit my loyalty and then discard me when it became inconvenient. I'm very interested, I said. When would you need a decision? Take your time, Thomas Chen replied. But I'd like to announce the expansion plans at our quarterly board meeting next month, so ideally we'd finalize the details within the next 2 weeks. Walking back to my office, I felt the kind of professional excitement that comes with genuine opportunity and meaningful work. The vice president position would allow me to implement the community development vision on a much larger scale, creating affordable housing and support services for families throughout the western United States. It was exactly the kind of work I'd dreamed of doing when I'd first started studying project management, but I'd never imagined reaching this level of responsibility so quickly. Karen was waiting with messages and scheduling requests when I returned, but she immediately noticed the change in my expression. Good news from the executive floor, she asked with a knowing smile. Very good news, I replied. But let's focus on this Portland presentation first. I want to make sure we've covered every possible angle before I start thinking about future opportunities. The rest of the afternoon was spent preparing presentation materials and rehearsing responses to potential questions from city council members. The work felt more important than ever, knowing that success in Portland could lead to expanded opportunities to create similar programs throughout the western states. Each slide of demographic data and community benefit analysis represented real families who needed affordable housing options in an increasingly expensive housing market. Around 6 p.m., as I was finishing preparation work and getting ready to leave for the day, my office phone rang with an internal call from the reception desk. The security guard downstairs informed me that someone was in the lobby asking to see me, identifying herself as my sister Victoria. The news sent an unexpected jolt of anxiety through my chest. Victoria had never visited me at work during our entire adult relationship, preferring to meet at coffee shops or restaurants when we needed to have serious conversations. Her decision to come to my office, particularly without advance notice, suggested that whatever had prompted her recent phone calls was more urgent than typical family business. Should I send her up? The security guard asked. I considered the options quickly. Refusing to see her would create workplace drama and potential embarrassment for both of us. Agreeing to meet with her would interrupt my evening plans but would also give me the opportunity to address whatever issue had prompted her unexpected visit on my terms rather than hers. Please send her up to the 28th floor, I said. I'll meet her at the elevator. I used the few minutes before Victoria's arrival to clear my desk and compose myself emotionally for whatever conversation was about to occur. 6 weeks of silence between us had provided time for my initial anger and hurt to evolve into something more complex, disappointment, certainly, but also a kind of clarity about what our relationship had actually been versus what I'd thought it was. The elevator doors opened to reveal Victoria dressed in an expensive coat and designer boots that hadn't been part of her wardrobe before marrying Michael. Marriage to someone from a wealthy family had clearly elevated her lifestyle and fashion budget, though her expression seemed tense and uncertain rather than confident and happy. Hello, Victoria, I said neutrally, gesturing for her to follow me toward my office. Her eyes widened as she took in the elegant corridor, the impressive views from the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the obvious markers of executive-level responsibility. "Nicole, I had no idea your office was so impressive," she said, clearly struggling to process the physical evidence of my professional advancement. "The Community Development Initiative has been very successful," I replied, opening my office door and offering her one of the chairs across from my desk. "Thomas Chen believes in providing appropriate resources for important work." Victoria settled into the chair, her gaze moving around my office and taking in details like the awards on my bookshelf, the architectural drawings of affordable housing projects on my walls, and the view of Mount Hood framed by the western windows. Her expression suggested that she was recalculating assumptions about my life and circumstances that had been based on outdated information. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks," she began, her voice carrying a note of reproach that implied I was being unreasonable by not responding to her attempts at communication. "I've been busy with work," I replied honestly. "The Community Development Program requires extensive travel and project coordination. My schedule has been quite demanding." The excuse was true but incomplete. My schedule had indeed been demanding, but I'd also chosen to prioritize professional responsibilities over family drama because the work felt more productive and meaningful than relitigating decisions that couldn't be undone. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly struggling to find the right tone for a conversation she'd apparently been planning for weeks. "Nicole, I think we need to clear the air about what happened at my wedding. There have been some misunderstandings about my decisions that day, and I want to explain my perspective so we can move forward." The word misunderstandings triggered the same irritation it had induced in her text messages and phone calls. Victoria's consistent refusal to acknowledge that her wedding behavior had been a deliberate choice rather than a misunderstanding revealed either profound self-deception or calculated manipulation designed to avoid accountability. "There weren't any misunderstandings, Victoria," I said calmly. "You announced in front of 200 people that adopted family members should sit in the back rows because family photos were for real family only. That statement was clear and unambiguous." Victoria's face flushed slightly, but she pressed forward with what sounded like a prepared explanation. "That announcement wasn't my idea, Nicole. I was under enormous pressure from Michael's family to present a certain image, to honor traditional family structures. I thought you would understand that sometimes we have to make difficult compromises to keep peace in complex family situations." Her explanation was almost identical to the one she'd given me at the reception 6 weeks ago, blaming external pressure for decisions that reflected her own priorities and values. But now I had information that completely contradicted her narrative about family pressure and traditional expectations. "Victoria," I said quietly, "I've spoken extensively with Thomas Chen about family values and traditional structures. He believes that inclusion and kindness matter more than bloodlines, that the strength of a family is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable members. Your decision to exclude adopted family members wasn't something he endorsed or encouraged." The color drained from Victoria's face as she realized that her primary excuse for the wedding behavior had been exposed as false. For several seconds, she seemed unable to find words to respond, her carefully prepared explanation having been demolished by inconvenient facts. "Thomas Chen said that?" she asked weakly. "He said that, and much more," I replied. "He also apologized for your behavior and made it clear that your decisions about seating and family photos didn't reflect his values or expectations. So your explanation about family pressure appears to have been convenient fiction designed to avoid taking responsibility for your own choices." Victoria stared down at her hands, her expensive manicure providing stark contrast to the shabby emotional honesty that was finally being demanded of her. When she looked up again, her expression was different, less defensive, more vulnerable, but also somehow smaller. "Nicole, I know I handled things badly that day," she said softly. "But I was scared about fitting into Michael's world, about being accepted by his family and friends. Everything felt so complicated and high stakes." Her admission was closer to honesty than anything she'd said since the wedding, but it still fell short of genuine accountability. Fear and insecurity were understandable emotions, but they didn't justify the decision to publicly humiliate someone who had spent months and thousands of dollars supporting her happiness. "Victoria," I said, "I understand that you were nervous about fitting into a new family and social circle. But you chose to manage that anxiety by sacrificing our relationship rather than by standing up for family values that should have mattered more than social appearance. She was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing the implications of what I'd said. I know I hurt you, she finally admitted. And I know my explanations probably sound like excuses. But Nicole, we're sisters. Surely our relationship is strong enough to survive one terrible decision made under pressure. The appeal to our sisterhood would have been compelling 6 weeks ago, when I still believed that family bonds were permanent and unconditional. But my perspective had been fundamentally changed by both her betrayal and my subsequent professional success. I'd learned that some relationships were based on genuine love and mutual respect, while others were based on convenience and conditional acceptance. Victoria, I said gently, I think our relationship has always been more fragile than either of us wanted to admit. If it was strong enough to survive your wedding decisions, you wouldn't have needed to make those decisions in the first place. Her eyes filled with tears, but they seemed to be tears of frustration and self-pity rather than genuine remorse or understanding. So that's it? One bad day and our entire relationship is over? 23 years of being sisters means nothing because I made a mistake under pressure? Her framing of the situation as, one bad day, and, a mistake under pressure, revealed that she still didn't understand the magnitude of what had occurred or the deeper issues that her wedding behavior had revealed about our relationship dynamics. Victoria, I said, this isn't about one bad day. This is about what that day revealed about how you see our relationship and what you're willing to sacrifice when it becomes inconvenient. You didn't just make a mistake under pressure. You made a deliberate choice to prioritize social appearance over family loyalty, and then you tried to avoid accountability by blaming external pressure that didn't actually exist. She sat in silence for several minutes, tears streaming down her face as the full implications of her wedding decisions and their aftermath finally seemed to register. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. I miss you, Nicole. I miss our relationship the way it used to be. I miss having someone I could talk to about everything, someone who understood me and supported me no matter what. The admission was heartbreaking because it revealed genuine regret, but it also highlighted the fundamental selfishness that had characterized our relationship dynamic. Victoria missed having me available for emotional support and practical assistance, but she hadn't demonstrated any understanding of what I had lost or any commitment to the kind of changes that would be necessary to rebuild trust. I miss that relationship too, I said honestly. But I don't think it can be restored by pretending that what happened at your wedding was acceptable or understandable. Real relationships require mutual respect and genuine accountability, not just apologies and explanations designed to minimize responsibility. Victoria wiped her eyes with a tissue from the box on my desk, her makeup now smeared and her carefully styled hair disheveled from emotional stress. What would it take, Nicole? What would I need to do to make things right between us? It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer, though I suspected that the answer would be more challenging than Victoria was prepared to accept. I think it would require you to understand why your wedding decisions were fundamentally wrong, not just unfortunate or poorly timed, I said. It would require genuine remorse for the pain you caused, not just regret about the consequences you're experiencing. And it would require demonstrable changes in how you think about family loyalty and conditional acceptance. Victoria nodded slowly, as if she was trying to understand concepts that were foreign to her worldview. And if I could do those things, if I could change and grow and become a better sister, would you be willing to try rebuilding our relationship? Her question was sincere, but it also revealed how little she understood about the damage that had been done and the work that would be required to repair it. Trust that had been broken through deliberate betrayal couldn't be restored through good intentions and promises of future behavior. It required consistent demonstration over time that fundamental changes had occurred. I think that would depend on whether the changes were genuine and lasting, I said carefully. And whether they reflected actual growth in your understanding of what family means, or just strategic adjustments designed to get what you want from me. Victoria stood to leave, her expensive coat and designer accessories unable to mask the emotional defeat that had characterized the final portion of our conversation. I understand, she said quietly. I have a lot to think about, and probably a lot of growing to do before I can even ask you to consider forgiving me. Her acknowledgement was the closest thing to genuine accountability I'd heard from her since the wedding, suggesting that perhaps some authentic self-reflection might be possible. But I also recognized that people rarely changed fundamental aspects of their character unless the consequences of their current behavior became too painful to ignore. "Take care of yourself, Victoria," I said as she reached my office door. "And think seriously about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of relationships you want to have. Those are important questions that go beyond our specific situation." After she left, I sat in my office watching the lights of Portland twinkle in the darkness beyond my windows. The conversation had been emotionally draining but also oddly clarifying, forcing me to articulate standards for relationships that I'd never consciously formulated before. Victoria's visit had reminded me of the pain and disappointment her wedding behavior had caused, but it had also highlighted how much my life had improved during the weeks of separation from her drama. The professional success I'd achieved, the meaningful work I was doing, the respect and recognition I'd earned from colleagues and supervisors, none of it would have been possible if I'd remained focused on managing Victoria's emotional needs and accommodating her shifting priorities. Sometimes the greatest gift people give you is showing you exactly who they are when the stakes are high, even when that revelation is painful. My desk phone rang with a call from Thomas Chen, who was apparently working late in his own office several floors above mine. "Nicole, I hope I'm not interrupting your evening, but I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the vice president position." "Of course," I replied, grateful for the opportunity to focus on positive professional developments rather than complicated family dynamics. "I've been thinking about our expansion plans, and I'm increasingly convinced that you're the right person to lead this initiative," he said. "Your community engagement approach has been so successful that I'd like to accelerate the timeline for both your promotion and the program expansion." The news felt like a perfect counterpoint to the emotional heaviness of Victoria's visit. While my personal relationship with my sister remained damaged and uncertain, my professional life was thriving in ways that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. "I'm honored by your confidence," I said. "And I'm excited about the opportunity to expand this work to help more communities throughout the western states." "Good," Thomas Chen replied. "Because I have one more surprise for you. The Portland City Council presentation next week will be your debut as Vice President of Community Development. If you're ready for that level of responsibility and public representation, I'd like to announce your promotion beforehand so the council knows they're hearing from our senior executive leadership." The timeline was faster than I'd expected, but it felt natural rather than rushed. The work I'd been doing had prepared me for greater responsibility, and the community development mission was too important to delay because of conventional concerns about promotion schedules and corporate hierarchy. "I'm ready," I said, meaning it completely. As I finally prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in the 6 weeks since Victoria's wedding. The sister who had publicly rejected me was now visiting my executive office to apologize and ask for reconciliation. The family whose traditional values had supposedly required my humiliation had instead offered me the greatest professional opportunity of my career. The community development work that had emerged from my experience of exclusion was now expanding to serve thousands of families throughout the western United States. Sometimes justice arrived not as dramatic revenge or public vindication, but as quiet opportunities to build something better from the wreckage of what you thought you wanted. Victoria's wedding had taught me painful lessons about conditional love and social hierarchy, but it had also introduced me to people who valued character over convenience, inclusion over appearance, genuine accomplishment over inherited privilege. The elevator descended through the 32 floors of the Chen Industries building, carrying me from the executive heights where important decisions were made to the parking garage where my modest Honda Civic waited among the luxury vehicles that reflected Portland's growing prosperity. But the contrast no longer felt like a reminder of what I lacked. Instead, it felt like evidence of what I'd earned through my own efforts and integrity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges with the community development projects, new opportunities to create affordable housing for families who needed safe places to call home, new chances to demonstrate that meaningful work and authentic relationships could flourish when they were built on foundations of mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. The road ahead stretched through the familiar Portland neighborhoods toward home, lit by streetlights and the promise of possibilities that had seemed impossible just 6 weeks ago. Victoria's wedding had ended one chapter of my life, but it had also begun another one that was proving to be far more satisfying than anything I could have imagined while arranging white orchids and believing that love was always enough to guarantee your place in someone's heart. 2 years later, I stood before a crowd of 300 community leaders, city officials, and future residents at the grand opening of Harmony Heights, our largest affordable housing development to date. The complex stretched across 12 acres in southeast Portland, featuring 180 units designed specifically for working families, seniors, and individuals transitioning out of homelessness. Gardens and playgrounds dotted the landscaping, while a community center offered job training programs, childcare services, and health clinics. As I cut the ribbon alongside Portland's mayor and several city council members, I thought about how far the community development program had expanded since those early days in Thomas Chen's office. What had begun as a regional initiative now operated in 8 states, providing affordable housing for over 15,000 families. The program had won national recognition for innovative design, community engagement, and measurable social impact. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying across the assembled crowd, Harmony Heights represents more than just affordable housing. It represents the belief that everyone deserves a safe place to call home, that strong communities are built through inclusion rather than exclusion, and that meaningful change happens when we choose compassion over convenience. The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most were the faces in the crowd, families who would be moving into their new homes within the week, children who would attend the on-site after-school programs, elderly residents who would have access to healthcare and social services just steps from their front doors. Each project had taught me that architecture was never just about buildings, it was about creating foundations for people to build better lives. After the ceremony, I was approached by Maria Santos, a single mother of 2 who had been selected for one of the 3-bedroom units. "Miss Harper," she said, tears in her eyes, "I've been on waiting lists for affordable housing for 4 years. When I got the call about Harmony Heights, I couldn't believe it was real. My kids are going to have their own bedrooms for the first time in their lives." Conversations like these reminded me why the work mattered so profoundly. Every budget meeting, every construction delay, every zoning hearing was ultimately about families like Maria's, people who needed safe, stable housing to pursue education, careers, and dreams that might otherwise remain impossible. Thomas Chen appeared at my elbow as the crowd began to disperse, his expression reflecting the pride of someone who had watched a vision become reality through dedicated execution. "Remarkable event, Nicole," he said. "The media coverage alone will help us secure funding for the Sacramento and Phoenix projects." "More importantly," I replied, "it shows other cities what's possible when public and private sectors work together with genuine community input. We're receiving inquiries from mayors in Colorado and Arizona who want to replicate this model." The expansion opportunities were exciting but also humbling. Each new project required careful adaptation to local conditions, community needs, and political dynamics. The one-size-fits-all approach that characterized many corporate social responsibility initiatives would never work for authentic community development. Success required listening, learning, and building relationships based on trust rather than transaction. As we walked toward the parking area, Thomas Chen's expression became more personal. "Nicole, I have some news that I wanted to share with you privately. Michael and Victoria are getting divorced." The information shouldn't have surprised me, but it still created a complex mix of emotions. Victoria's marriage had represented her entry into a world of social status and financial security that she desperately wanted. Its dissolution suggested that surface-level compatibility and shared ambition weren't sufficient foundations for lasting partnership. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said honestly. "Divorce is always difficult, regardless of the circumstances." "Victoria has been asking about you," Thomas Chen continued carefully. "Apparently, she's been in therapy and has gained some perspective on her behavior at the wedding. Michael mentioned that she's expressed genuine remorse about how she treated you." The possibility of renewed contact with Victoria stirred feelings I'd thought were resolved. Our relationship had been severed for over 2 years, during which I'd built a life and career that felt complete without her involvement. Reopening that door would require careful consideration of whether forgiveness was possible and whether reconciliation would be beneficial for either of us. "If she wants to reach out to me directly, I'm open to listening," I said. "But I think any conversation would need to acknowledge that we're very different people than we were 2 years ago." 3 weeks later, Victoria did call. Her voice was smaller, less confident than I remembered, carrying the weight of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. "Nicole, I know I have no right to contact you after everything that happened, but I wanted you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. Not just about the wedding, but about what family means and how I treated our relationship. Our conversation lasted an hour, during which Victoria shared details about her therapy process, her growing understanding of how adoption trauma had affected her worldview, and her recognition that she'd used me as an emotional scapegoat for her own insecurities about belonging and acceptance. Her apology felt genuine, rooted in self-awareness rather than self-interest. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said near the end of our call. "I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed and how much it meant. Watching your success from a distance has made me realize what an incredible person you are and how lucky I was to have you as a sister." We agreed to meet for coffee the following month, with the understanding that rebuilding trust would be a long process requiring consistent demonstration of changed priorities and values. Victoria's divorce had apparently provided the catalyst for genuine self-reflection, but only time would reveal whether her insights translated into lasting behavioral change. 6 months later, we were meeting monthly for carefully structured conversations that felt more like building a new relationship than repairing an old one. Victoria had started volunteering with a local adoption support organization, working with families navigating the complex emotions around blended family dynamics. Her transformation seemed authentic, though I remained cautious about reopening my heart to someone who had demonstrated such callous disregard for our bond. "I think about that wedding constantly," she told me during one of our coffee meetings. "Not because I regret marrying Michael, but because I regret becoming someone I didn't recognize. I was so desperate to fit into his world that I sacrificed everything that actually mattered." The community development program continued expanding, now operating as an independent nonprofit organization with Chen Industries as the primary funding partner. We'd successfully lobbied for federal legislation providing tax incentives for affordable housing developments that met specific community engagement criteria. The model was being studied by urban planning programs at universities across the country. Standing in my office one evening, looking out at the Portland skyline that had become a symbol of home and accomplishment, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of family and success had evolved. The sister who had once rejected me was slowly earning her way back into my life through consistent demonstration of growth and commitment to better values. The career that had emerged from professional recognition of my character had become a platform for creating lasting social change. Thomas Chen knocked on my door, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the expression of someone with extraordinary news to share. "Nicole, the MacArthur Foundation called today. You've been selected for a fellowship recognizing your innovative approach to community development and social justice." The MacArthur Fellowship, often called a Genius Grant, represented the highest level of recognition for transformative work in social innovation. The award would provide substantial funding for continued expansion of affordable housing initiatives while offering a platform to advocate for policy changes at the national level. "This is recognition for all the families whose lives have been changed by this work," I said, meaning it completely. "Every unit we've built, every community we've served, every partnership we've created has contributed to this moment." Later that evening, as I drove through the familiar Portland neighborhoods toward home, I thought about the wedding that had ended one chapter of my life and begun another. Victoria's betrayal had taught me painful lessons about conditional love and social hierarchy, but it had also introduced me to people and opportunities that valued authentic character over inherited privilege. The road ahead stretched toward possibilities that would have seemed impossible during those dark weeks following the wedding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges with community development projects, new opportunities to create affordable housing for families who needed safe places to call home, new chances to demonstrate that meaningful change emerged from integrity rather than convenience. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as devastating losses, teaching us that we're stronger than we knew and capable of building something better than what we thought we wanted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.